This right here is Car Con Carne. Car Con Carne is a Q101 podcast. I'm James VanOsdol. Car Con Carne is sponsored by Exploding House Printing. Exploding House Printing is here for all your screen printing, embroidery, and other merchandising needs. They're local. They're over in Hermosa, and you should consider them. If you're a brand or someone who is running a business, you should consider them for your t-shirts, merch, whatever. They focus on small businesses, bands, brands, everything in between. They've worked on products for The Empty Bottle, Dante's Pizzeria, The Music Box, The Botanic Garden. The list goes on and on. And Jonathan, the guy behind Exploding House, he's been doing this for a very long time. He knows what he's doing, and besides the technical expertise he brings to your projects, he delivers production efficiency and cost awareness so he can offer boutique print shop quality at much lower large print shop prices. Check them out on Instagram at Exploding House, or check out their site at explodinghouseprinting.com for a quote, or just to check out the list of their clients.
It's Car Con Carne. Let's eat in the car. It's Car Con Carne. And now here's the star of our show, James VanOsdol.
So I am on Broadway in front of Sunwa Barbecue. I come for the duck, stay for the duck. That's it. Mike Gebert is to my right. He is one of my all-time favorite food writers. He's a James Beard Award winner who just published a deep-reaching oral history of Chicago's culinary scene, The Chicago Way, an oral history of Chicago dining. Mike talked to the big names, the big personalities, the big storytellers, who all contributed to decades of incredible American cuisine. And like any good oral history, the immediate appeal, I suppose, is to the core audience, the foodies, the literal tastemakers. But it's also immediately interesting, I think, to anyone who loves reading behind-the-scenes insights and lore. I love some good lore. Nice to see you, Mike. It's
good
been a long
to see
time.
you. Yeah.
Hold that book up, because that is a tome. That is not a small book.
Right.
Here, let's see the spine of that, just to give a sense of the width of that book. That is a significant amount of work. And let's start there. When I first knew of you working on this, I thought the idea was kind of quixotic. Like, no way could you ever compile enough, get enough, finish it, get it to the finish line. It just seemed like too much work for one, maybe too broad, too deep, but you did it.
Yeah, I really tried to come up with the story that I wanted to tell, so I wasn't tempted by, another place that had, deep fried chocolate schnitzel was,
right,
that kind of thing. I really wanted, to show how it had evolved. It's less about any particular restaurant, although obviously there are restaurants that had to be in there. Mm-hmm. But I wanted it to kind of show how the world has changed. I mean, it starts out in this very Mad Men world of the 60s where, women trying to work in the French restaurants were told, we can't have women in here. It would be too distracting for the men.
Oh, man. Not surprising at all, but wow.
Not surprising, but you're still kind of amazed to hear it within, recent history. And from there, just kind of show how the city had changed, the neighborhoods that became hot, because restaurants are a great way to make a hot neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Hot enough to force the restaurants to leave the neighborhood when the prices go up. And then, just kind of show how it changed, how what we went out, why we went out and what we went out for changed over time. So that, once I kind of worked out a storyline for that, it wasn't that hard to say, this place belongs, this place doesn't particularly belong. So I could do that.
That sounds very focused. Now, I'm very fascinated by the mechanics of all this. I self-published an oral history 10 plus years ago, and every time I would interview someone, they would say, have you talked to this person yet?
Yeah.
I'd be like, and I felt like I could never whittle the list down enough.
Yeah. No, I always asked people, who else should I talk to? Because I wanted, who has the skinny on this? And so, probably half the book is people I know who they are. They're well-known names. Mm-hmm. But half of it is, guys who were like waiters or general managers, or, occasionally there's just people who were, diners at these places that I just happened to run across. And so, trying to really show, the whole, from the top to the bottom, how the restaurant industry, existed.
And why an oral history? I love the medium. I love the way it turned out in the Chicago way. But as opposed, you're a celebrated food writer. You're a Beard Award winner. Why not just be that kind of third-person voice?
Well, the reason really is that the publisher, Agate, had done an oral history of Chicago theater over roughly the same time. And so they approached me about doing one about restaurants, another subject that seemed to be, a site of Chicago creativity over that time. I assume they must be working on a book about basketball somewhere. But anyway, so I kind of had the format handed to me, but I didn't mind at all. People have asked me, did you find it limiting? And it's like, no, actually, I found it a lot like editing video, which I've done a lot of.
I could see that.
You find the clips, and you get to the pithy line, and then you cut on that.
Yeah.
So it's very much like that.
You think we all think in sound bites.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I just, I was a little tired of my own voice, so I didn't mind not hearing what I think about Alinea or Stephanie Izard or whatever. It was more interesting to, kind of get the underlying story.
Now, as far as like the Chicago dining cliches, were there hard lines drawn? Like, I'm not going to go too deep into the topics of pizza or hot dogs or...
it was interesting. I feel guilty about this, actually, coming to talk to you, because, so many of... we first got to know each other because I would have recently done a list at Thrillist or somewhere of, Italian beef places.
Yes.
And then, you'd call me to show up at WGN at 2 a.m. And,
I worked the most glamorous hours at that radio station.
What I really liked was parking downstairs and then having to climb that 2-story metal metal stairway in the dead of winter. I thought, well, I'll either be on the radio or I'll be found here tomorrow.
I'll be food for the rats.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of my thing. I was the guy who did all of that, and now suddenly I'm Mr. Fancy Schmancy food guy, and I felt kind of guilty about that with you, because I feel like I'm betraying what I used to be. But it was there are a couple of reasons. One, I think just the reality, if you open an Italian beef place and it turns out to be great, it stays exactly the same for 50 years. That's one issue. And also, the history of some of those places is hard to find. I always think of there's a place in Lincoln Park called Francis's Deli, and it goes back to the 30s. And I was talking to the guy at Francis's one time, and basically they don't know who Francis was. They don't know the history of this place. It just was, it wasn't recorded. There was certainly no mainstream coverage of it then. It wasn't the kind of place that would get attention like that. So, there are just a lot of things that are, kind of lost in the mists of time that way. The more upscale restaurants with prominent chefs, the Charlie Trotters of the world, they left history because they were changing to stay at the front of the game, reacting to whatever else was happening in the food scene, really not only locally but worldwide. Mm-hmm. And so, you could trace a story there that wasn't, well, then we decided to put giardiniera on the beef, and and people sure liked that. They liked it for 50 years. Yep. I've done interviews like that. I interviewed a barbecue guy in Texas one time, and it was painful to get 10 minutes out of him. And I think I used nearly every minute that we talked, because it was all gold, but it was terse. Mm-hmm. It was all short. So
I'm going to jump around only because you invoked the name of Charlie Trotter. When I was much younger, living in the city for my first time, that was the name I knew and understood as fine dining in Chicago.
Right.
That was it. Based on what I know, what I read in the Chicago way, is his legacy complicated?
Oh yeah, that was really the hardest chapter, because that's where I had the most people who I'd ask them to talk about him, and they'd say, "Yeah, I don't really want to do that." Click.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of PTSD about Charlie out there. There's a lot of I've talked about him enough to people, and so I wound up mostly talking to the people who had a fairly favorable memory of him, but at the same time, I had to push them, find the story where, Sari Worsham, who she and her husband own MFK now, which is a nice kind of Spanish seafood restaurant. Anyway, she's a sweet lady. She tells a story about, Trotter sort of riding her and pushing other people to ride her one day, and she just winds up walloping Reggie Watkins, who was really the kind of the key guy in the kitchen, just punches him in his back, and he hits the floor on his knees, but he's just laughing out loud. Mama hit me, is kind of his reaction. So there are levels of that kind of stress in all these places, and there are a lot of legends too with Trotter. They would claim that they never made the same dish twice, that it changed every day. Well, that's plainly impossible. I mean, you change, you find something that works. Why would you throw it away after one night? That's just insane. But, so I really grilled the people who were doing the actual cooking, the actual, recipe creation. People like Giuseppe Tintori of Boca and GT, Fish and Oyster, whatever his restaurants were, or Bill Kim, people like that. I asked, so how did recipe development work there, and what it was you might start with a dish and it would be on the menu for a week, but if they knew you'd been there before, they would not serve you the exact same thing you'd had last time. They'd make sure you got something else. And if you walked in with some big baller wine that didn't really go with the menu as it was, they would adjust it to favor, the Latache, red wine that you brought in or something like that. So there were things going on there that make it kind of true enough, I guess.
Well, and you don't shy away from the toxicity and intensity of some of those kitchens back in the day. One of the things that concerned me about doing this interview, lots of chefs' names I can't pronounce.
Sure.
I've only seen in print. In fact, all the toxic ones or all the big names from that certain era
are all like that.
Let's talk with, is it Louis?
Louis Zathmari, okay. Yes.
The first celebrity chef of Chicago.
Yeah, I had to find a place to start the story. And obviously that with an oral history, that depends on people still being alive.
Yeah.
So I kind of settled on Zathmari. I felt like partly because of his media presence, which was real. He was on, all the shows of the day, the Phil Donahues and Oprah and Dinah Shore and Mike Douglas and all these things. But also, he was himself a personality. I've compared him, I worked at Leo Burnett in advertising, and their big thing was critters, The Keebler elves were critters, and a critter sums up your brand. Well, Louis was basically a critter. He was kind of a pretend French chef. Not that he wasn't, a good chef, but he kind of created this myth of, himself being this great big guy with a toque on his head and a great big mustache and all this stuff. And the reality was, he had worked in industrial food. You can actually go to Jewel and buy a Stouffer spinach souffle, and that was one of his recipes. So you can still eat his food.
I think we've all had those.
Yeah. You can eat it 30 years after you died. So,
that's why I had no idea. That's wild.
Yeah. There were just ways in which I felt he was kind of a modern figure and sort of represented Chicago in that he was both this kind of industrial food scientist, but also a chef and a personality in his restaurant. I think he sort of, occupies the perfect middle ground between someone like a later French chef like Jean Banchet and Ray Kroc, who is really the most important Chicago food figure ever. But does not appear in my book.
No.
So
that was a generation or two too early.
Yeah.
Speaking about French food, La Francais, I feel like in the present day, a food scene could not possibly start in the suburbs.
Yeah.
Or a reputation couldn't start in the suburbs.
No, I think that was another question I tried to solve, is like, when did it come back to the city? because that was a thing then. There was
and that was in Wheeling.
That was in Wheeling, which is way out. There was one up in McHenry called Le Vichyssoise that, you'd drive an hour and a half to go eat dinner. You'd eat dinner for 3 hours, then you'd drive an hour and a half back. I mean, you might as well be going to Milwaukee at that point.
It's true.
And people just did that. And it really wasn't until Trotter that the city kind of reasserted itself, and you could come to the city. And then by the time that like Grant Achatz is at Trio in Evanston, it really had shifted to where he had to come to the city and open a restaurant because Evanston was just too far for people in the city.
What makes a lot of these chefs, a lot of these big names, what gives them their outsized personalities? Do they come to the industry with those personalities, or does the industry shape those personalities?
I mean, I think some of them, it was definitely calculated. I think Zathmari is a good example of someone who saw a part that he could play and started playing it, to the hilt. Others were, I think, genuine veterans of those French restaurants. I mean, Jean Banchet of Le Francais worked with Paul Bocuse in Lyon and worked at La Pyramide, which is was one of the top French restaurants at that time. It still is. I say that like I know and have been to all these places, which is not at all true.
I'm just nodding along.
Yeah. But, they knew the part to play, whether or not they came out of that world or not. So that was it. But then the other thing that happens is somebody like Trotter, devises a new part to play, basically. He's the American version of that. He wants to do American cooking, but on the same level of precision and pretension, perhaps, as the French chefs did. So, he sort of figured out how to make that happen with the mentality of a high school hockey player from the North Shore, basically.
Yeah, I mean, some of these kitchen descriptions in your book, I mean, they sound like hell on earth.
Yeah.
I mean, just like military.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are people who defend it in the book and say, it's about knowing that the guy to your left and the guy to your right have your back, and and all of that. But there's a great story. Was it? I think Greg Biggers, who was a chef here, telling about working at True, which was one of Lettuce Entertainer's fancy schmancy restaurants, and he notices that the guy next to him has set his beard on fire, and his reaction to that is just thinking internally, yeah, that guy's not going to work out. He's on fire, so.
When did the transition to less paramilitary operations in the kitchen happen?
Well, in the book, I kind of deliberately put in a distinct break. I think you go from Trotter, who's pretty tyrannical, sometimes with a sense of humor about it. I mean, people loved it if they heard Charlie yell. He would do the kitchen table, but if he saw somebody looking at their watch, he'd grab the clock off the wall and throw it in the trash can and say, "You're done eating when I tell you you're done eating." And then that made their night. Oh, it's so exciting. Charlie Trotter yelled at us.
Oh my gosh.
But then, right after that, I talk about Tony Mantuano of Spiaggia and Rick Bayless of Frontera. And both of them, I think, were the anti-Trotters in that first of all, they liked peasant cuisines, Italian for Mantuano, Mexican, obviously, for Bayless. They also, they were very interested in local produce, finding it, making it happen. Spiaggia, when they first were using fresh basil in the place, they had to go to a head shop and buy grow lights to be able to grow it in the window.
That's amazing.
You just couldn't order that stuff. He says you'd order radicchio and you'd get a head of red cabbage, which tastes nothing like radicchio. So they really wanted to develop the availability of good products, but also connections to their countries. They would take their people to visit those places and see what they're about. And they also just did not want to have abuse kitchens. They wanted it. I mean, they're demanding certainly, but they wanted, people to just be able to have a decent career there. Not, they didn't want the kitchens to be about sex and drugs and all that stuff. So, really trying to, what I would say is maybe the other American aspect of it is just a more reasonable workplace compared to France. So,
jumping around a little bit, what kind of debt does River North owe to Gordon Sinclair?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was a really interesting story to me because I kind of vaguely knew it, but I didn't really know it. I mean, it's two people. It's Al Friedman, who was the big real estate developer in that area. Really, I mean, first of all, he renamed it River North. It was, it had names like the Clark Street Flop Houses and things like that. And, the most famous place down there was the Baton. So the drag bar and show. So he thought, well, if people come here for restaurants, then my property becomes more valuable. So he really sought out restaurants. And Gordon Sinclair had Gordon. It was really the first one there. It was, I would say, kind of the first New York style, very trendy and very gay restaurant. Had a huge sort of ladies who lunch crowd and stuff like that. And, that just took off in a way. It made people excited to go to this kind of dodgy area. Bayless says when they opened Frontera, people would say, "Where's your restaurant?" And say, "We're catty-cornered from Gordon." "Oh, then I guess it's okay. I guess it's safe. I won't die going to eat Mexican food." So, and he also tells the story of when they, kind of redid one of the buildings there in the complex where Frontera and Topolobampo are. It just released thousands of rats.
I'm sure.
And they paid the fire department next to them to sit out back with BB guns and just shoot them all day long. Bayless talks about when they go to their car out back, they'd carry a broomstick and just, hit it on the ground to scare the rats away so they could get in the car without any unexpected passengers.
Oh my God. Couldn't do it.
Speaking of being in a car.
Yes. Well, you talked about neighborhoods when we first sat down and started talking. And I mean, this is, a great example. Gordon comes in and that area, begins its transformation. Rick Bayless comes on board. Are there any, quote, blighted areas left in Chicago?
It seems harder and harder to find them. And I wonder what that's going to do to how the city has worked. There's always been another neighborhood to move to, and restaurants have benefited enormously from that. But with Bronzeville, filling up, that has, kind of trendy places now, at least to some extent. And the South Loop is finally happening. That one's been waiting to happen for decades. I mean, it's not like, I mean, I remember when I first moved here and I was near DePaul, and people would talk about, oh, you don't want to cross Ashland. That's death for sure. Well, lots of people have nice houses on the other side of Ashland now. Yeah,
there's a Hyatt over there now.
Exactly.
Things have changed.
Things have changed a little.
Would Rogers Park ever happen?
Yeah.
I feel like that's the only North Side neighborhood that hasn't.
Yeah.
At its moment.
I mean, it's still kind of there are some interesting ethnic restaurants up in that area. Actually, the publisher of the book was telling me that he went to a Sri Lankan restaurant up there.
Okay.
There's a cuisine I have never had. I'm not quite sure what it is, but one of these days I'll get there. But yeah, I mean, there's really these stories I tell of how, some new place took off, was scary at first and then got trendy and now it's all frat boys. That stuff happens. So I don't know if it'll keep happening, but
early on we talked about blue collar food. Blue Collar Eats, specifically the Billy Goat. Yeah. You have their moment in your book. Is that the quintessential real person dining experience?
It's certainly one of them. I remember when I went to a restaurant. We were in Barcelona, and it was like a seafood restaurant, but we get in there and it's just like a diner. And I sort of said to my wife, we just found the Billy Goat of Barcelona. And I mean, I didn't really talk about some of the ones that have been around forever. I mean, Billy Goat gets a reference because of the Saturday Night Live skit, which I think, that moment when Chicago sort of re-entered pop culture and wasn't just all about Al Capone, that's a big change in the way the city was viewed. And but one of the areas that I really wanted to talk about, two places, Spokanopoly and Hot Doug's, because I thought that's an example of how relatively modest priced places were changing how people thought about some kind of food. So Spokanopoly starts doing the real Neapolitan pizzas when you couldn't find those, and Hot Doug's, of course, is doing crazy stuff, rattlesnake sausages. And I always remember he said, people asked, what's it taste like? He'd say, it tastes like anaconda. And and then of course him getting busted for foie gras, that's the great irony that the only restaurant to get a ticket during the foie gras ban was a hot dog stand. That's just a Chicago moment.
It totally is a Chicago moment. So the book, can you hold it up again? The Chicago Way. This gigantic oral history. What is the Chicago Way?
It's they come at you with a knife, you come at them with a gun.
Straight out of the Untouchables.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't really come up with a definition of that, but I think you detect something, just the inventiveness and a certain amount of, humor and sort of sassiness about it. I mean, even Blanchet, who was running the most formal, old school French restaurant, if it was your birthday, they'd make you a hamburger and bring it out in a silver dome thing. Because it was, wanted people to think of dining out as being fun too, not just how pretentious can we make it. So I think you kind of see that attitude throughout, and to some extent also it's just the nature of the restaurant business. I mean, what's interesting to me about it, why I didn't feel like a total sellout writing about only high-end places, is that it is this weird combination of high-end, rich people, sometimes, artistic and pretentious cuisine as an art form, and at the same time, it's very much a blue-collar job. It's about sweating and working your butt off and being over a stove that's up to 280 degrees, and that's just where you live all day. So it's that nature of how it works. I mean, I think that's what we all find interesting about it. I think some chef I talked to once was saying, if you're in a corporate job, you can always say, well, let's table this and we'll come back to it in 2 weeks. And you can't do that in a restaurant. You can't go to the customer and say, we're going to table your entree and come back to it in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we'll ping you later.
Yeah, exactly. So it is, it has this particular flavor of sort of cutting the crap that people like about it. And I think that's why people who aren't in it and were never in it still find it an interesting world.
I love the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's true of any industry, but this one in particular, I especially love this book. I read you all the time. I subscribe to the Food Editor newsletter. I've read you for years. Is it possible that you learned something in the writing of this? Did you learn new things? Because I feel like you have eminence in this field. What's left for you to know?
Yeah, people have asked me, what was a surprise? And it's like, I've been working on it for 5 years. There were if something was a surprise, it stopped being one a long time ago. I guess the one...
Or did it change your opinions?
It changed certain things. The one that I point to the most was, Rick Tremonto and Gail Gand, who were at Trio. They worked for Lettuce at a bunch of their restaurants. They worked at True, Open True for Lettuce. I didn't really know them particularly. I'd met Gail at some event, but beyond that, I'd never met Rick, but he knew who I was as soon as I was on the phone with him. But it was just an interesting story about a couple who, get to the top of the business, open this super fancy restaurant with Rich Millman's money, but it wrecks their marriage. They're talking at the end about, that they learned how to divorce well, and not screw up their kid in the process and stuff like that. And also, how to handle it with your, with your staff. Rick talks about, he was telling people, we could come here and say nothing's going to change, and you'd all know that was a lie. But we didn't tell you for a long time, just so you could see that we can operate, without trying to kill each other in the kitchen, basically.
Smart.
So, I think that was maybe the story that I didn't know that I discovered. There was also a thing where, I kind of made the claim at the start of that chapter that they're sort of at the beginning, the headwaters of a couple of different trends. One is that, Grant Achatz and the theatrical stuff that he does at Alinea came out of him being at Trio, which came out of Rick and Gail being at Trio. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, Rick had worked in, restaurants where they butchered their own meat and stuff like that, and taught that to a bunch of people who went on to open, farm-to-table restaurants and stuff like that. So I made the claim as I'm writing it and thinking, what is this chapter about? What do I want to use? I made the claim that they were at the beginnings of both of these major currents in the restaurant business. And then I'm like, oh God, I hope I have the quotes to support this. So, which ultimately I did. So,
in the book, you say the next great era of Chicago dining's on the way. What does that look like?
The best thing I've seen since COVID ended is just people who are really committed to doing the food that they kind of grew up with and making it, serving it on the level of fanciness that they want it to be at, which isn't always that fancy. But it is more fancy than, the place their parents would have opened, mm-hmm. the Indian or Chinese restaurant or whatever. So, I think if someone there's a chef named Zubair Mohajir, I probably just, ruined that pretty badly. But anyway, he's Indian, and he has like some interesting Indian tinged restaurants, but also, he has one called Mira that's sort of Indian Mexican fusion. I mean, there's a lot of cumin in both, so why not?
Yeah, right.
And he also, he has like a breakfast place in Wicker Park where you can get like Pandan donuts. Pandan being
Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Yes, and that's the amazing thing. Pandan can. Stand with its feet on two different trucks right. Driving down the road. Kind of Mexican, I had this thing that sort of looked like a breakfast burrito, but was basically Indian flavored and stuff like that. So, they're playing around with their heritages, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. And
that, if I had to pick something was the coming thing, I think that's what it looks like is, some guy who's from wherever, Sri Lanka, say, mm-hmm. and decides I'm gonna do a Sri Lankan tasting menu, and people are gonna turn out for it. So.
Are other cities / markets as open to the breadth of cuisines that we have here in Chicago? Because it's stunning.
I would say, totally wussing out, yes and no. I think there is a general thing where, because of the Food Network, people see stuff on TV and they think, hey, why can't we have that? So they do open places that are more inventive in those ways. But at the same time, I think Chicago is pretty unique in that we're so accepting of that. Grant Achatz talks about Alinea, that he couldn't have done it somewhere else because Chicagoans, they come in whatever crazy thing they would be doing. Like, they had a lobster dish that they would put rosemary around it, and they'd come out with a hot teapot and pour that on the rosemary. So you're just sort of perfuming the whole room with rosemary. So it's lobster with rosemary sauce, except there's no sauce. It's just, lobster with rosemary air or whatever. People in Chicago would see something like that, and they're not like, what is this crap? And instead they're just, oh, we went to this place and they did this crazy thing.
That's exactly it. It's the bragging rights. Like, I'll have a story. Like, you won't believe what I tried.
Exactly.
I had Sri Lankan cuisine.
Right. Out of a test tube.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, that kind of thing, it flies here in a way that, I think so much of New York dining, it's not that they don't have things kind of like this, but it's kind of about serving Wall Street guys, and they care more about having a steak and, a really expensive bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's just, Chicago really isn't like that so much. Not that we don't eat a lot of steaks here, but, the show-offy part of it, I think, is rarer here, so...
Absolutely. Okay, so the new book, it's out. The Chicago Way, An Oral History of Chicago Dining. It's a tremendous achievement, and it's a starting point, because the story continues to be written.
Right. That's what I'm, can't wait to get started on the second edition. As soon as something changes enough to know what the story is. So.
But that raises an interesting question. as life marches on, are you taking notes? Are you like, seriously?
Yeah, no, I'm always thinking about it. Because, at least because people have been asking me that question, what's next? And it's like, if I knew that, I'd invest in restaurants.
Yes.
But yeah, it's, it is interesting, particularly after COVID, which just threw the industry for such a loop. It is interesting to think about, what will take off in the same way. Or will anything? Are there just too many chefs out there for any one of them to be as famous as like Trotter was in his day or something? I think there's some truth to that.
Well, and Trotter didn't come up in the digital era.
Right.
Where everyone's attention is fragmented and everyone's a celebrity.
He had the benefit for sure that people were not reviewing him opening night,
Yeah, exactly.
It gave him time to kind of figure out. When they opened, they had cocktails on the menu, and then he decided the cocktails, ruined your palate for his food, so they just went to purely wine. And they had dishes a la carte that you could just order, and then they went to we just want to do a tasting menu thing. Mm-hmm. So, it kind of took Trotter a while even to become Trotter. And it's interesting because I got to go there when it was only like a year old. My wife was going to law school, and that was back in the 80s when they would spend absurd amounts of money, whining and dining with people in law school. And, it was like a year old, but somehow we knew it was a big deal. We got invited to that was more exciting than being invited to go see, Driving Miss Daisy, which I remember we also did.
See, this is like writing an oral history. I keep thinking I'm wrapping up, then more things pop in my head. Thinking about, cocktails, wine service, we hear all the time, and I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to support this, that there are generations now that really aren't drinking. They're not drinking. Like, is the role of a sommelier destined to fade away? Are restaurants going to struggle?
I think they're struggling with not having the liquor sales they used to have, for sure. A couple things have happened. It's interesting. At the very beginning of the book, people are drinking coffee all through dinner, which,
I can't even imagine.
Can't imagine. And they're probably, half of them are smoking.
Oh, yeah.
Too. So, what are you even tasting? And then, they kind of teach people to appreciate wine, and that takes off. And then we kind of have the cocktail movement, and we have, good beer, artisanal beer and stuff like that. So I mean that evolves, but yeah, it's kind of fading now. Nobody has wine lists like those places used to have.
Sure.
I mean, you would not open a restaurant like that and thinking, and then I need to set $50,000 more aside to have a bunch of bottles that will sit there for a year.
Right.
Trotter could do that because he had his father's money, and his father's richer than God, but it just does not exist the way it used to. And also, I mean, what people want to drink, back then there was a short list of French wines that were what you drank if you had a certain amount of money, and now everybody's into oddball wine things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, I want I just blanked on what you call it, natural wines, which some of my friends absolutely, despise the idea. They say, what is this, domain to ocean spray? And, but it's, you read a magazine article that mentions, some wine from a particular funny little island somewhere in the Mediterranean, and then it's like, oh, I got to try that. So.
Yep. It's an interesting time for sure. All right, Mike, I love the book. I know this is a massive amount of effort. Congratulations on
thank you.
Getting it to the point where we can actually read it, talk about it, debate it, and just enjoy this the Chicago way.